When I think back in times in American history, when Congress has been called on to respond to an emergency, there have been amazing examples where partisanship was set aside and people said, in the interest of America, we need to act and act now. Whether we're talking about mobilizing for a war, whether we're talking about responding to terrorism, we've done it. We can do it. This time, we've failed. We've failed for 14 weeks. And in that period of time, 1,200 Americans in 44 states, Washington, D.C., and 3 U.S. territories, including over 110 pregnant women, have contracted Zika. 6 more have contracted Guillain-Barré, an autoimmune disorder that can cause paralysis and death. Recently, the first Zika-caused death and the first Zika-related microcephaly case was reported in Puerto Rico. In my state of Illinois, 16 people have tested positive for Zika, including at least 3 pregnant women. Over the past few months, we've learned more about Zika and how dangerous it can be. We now know it's carried by 2 types of mosquitoes. We now know it is linked to serious neurological damage and birth defects in children. And we now know it can be sexually transmitted. We also know the mosquitoes carrying the Zika virus thrive in the warm summer months, which is why this action should have been taken long ago and must be taken this week. The best way to fight a public health threat like Zika is to have a strong, stable public health infrastructure in place. That is what the president asked for. That means reliable and stable funding year after year after year. Our public health agencies have to be viewed as the first line of defense, just as we view the Pentagon as the first line of defense when it comes to military and terrorist threats. Our public health agencies are the first line of defense when we're speaking of Ebola, the Zika virus, and a variety of other challenges that could literally threaten the health and life of innocent Americans. We must ensure robust and stable funding for agencies like Centers for Disease Control. These invasive problems can pop up at any time. We can't rally to each and every occurrence after it happens. We have to be prepared. The Center for Disease Control is not only the best, it is the best in the world, but it cannot operate without adequate funding. And the National Institutes for Health. They're right now working on a vaccine to protect all of us against the Zika virus. That's the answer, but it takes time, a year. We should have been moving on it sooner. And we must provide critical resources to the Food and Drug Administration. Their reviewers are responsible for ensuring that any new Zika treatments or vaccines are safe and effective. They have to be clinically tested. For years, we've heard congressional Republicans rail against federal spending and even embrace the notion of a sequester, a blind across-the-board cut. Case in point, over the past few months, we've heard Republicans protest, stall, push back on providing funding to help combat the Zika virus. There have been a variety of excuses for their delay. The outcome has always been the same. We have lost time in responding to this public health emergency. For years, those of us on this side of the aisle have been arguing that this approach, one of starving funding and endless delay, is short-sighted and irresponsible. Yes, we must be good stewards of taxpayers' dollars, but I would argue there's no better use of taxpayer dollars than investments in public health, investments in the National Institutes for Health, the Center for Disease Control, and the Food and Drug Administration. These are investments that prepare our nation for the unseen, like Zika or Ebola. But they are also investments that help us prepare for the foreseen situations that Americans face every day: Alzheimer's, cancer, Parkinson's, diabetes. That's why I introduced the American Cures Act, legislation that would provide our federal health research agencies reliable and robust funding increases every year into the future. We're not going to win a war against Zika, Ebola, Alzheimer's, cancer, if our response is tepid, delayed, watered down, or subject to the winds of political fate. Big budget cuts may make a good talking point and a speech somewhere, but the results can be devastating. I look forward to continuing to work with my colleagues on the Senate Appropriations Committee to find a path forward on addressing the funding of these critical federal health agencies. There's more to do, and we must do it together. And if we don't do it together, we'll pay a heavy price. So this week, we'll take up the issue. We'll be voting on 3 Zika-related amendments this week. Now, the first, offered by Senator Nelson of Florida, is one that I fully support. It would fulfill the president's request by providing the $1.9 billion in needed funding to ensure immediate, comprehensive response to Zika. Treat this public health emergency like a public health emergency. Senator Nelson's amendment would ensure the CDC has the money they need to support states in conducting surveillance, vector control, emergency communications, and research. It would ensure that the National Institutes for Health has the money to develop this vaccine. And it would ensure that USAID has the money they need to build up a global health response to Zika. I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of the Nelson Amendment. It would provide the United States, as well as pregnant women in many affected countries, with our very best chance of minimizing the damage done by the Zika virus. Let's not be penny wise and pound foolish. Cutting back on this money for pregnant women and running the risk that a baby is born with a lifetime of medical challenges and expenses is no savings. It's a disaster for the family and a disaster for our budget. Then comes the Second Amendment, offered by Senator Cornyn of Texas. This is a misguided amendment. I urge my colleagues to defeat it. Senator Cornyn's amendment would provide a portion of the funding needed to adequately respond to the Zika virus. He picked the number $1.1 billion and said, let's take the money out of the Prevention and Public Health Fund for America, money that is currently being invested to deal with other health challenges around our country. So in order to deal with the Zika virus, he would take money away from other efforts to keep Americans healthy. The Prevention Fund accounts for 12%, nearly $900 million, of the Center for Disease Control's core public health efforts, such as lead poisoning prevention, breast and cervical cancer screenings, tobacco prevention and control. Think about that for a second. Senator Cornyn of Texas wants to take the money out of those areas, legitimate public health concerns, and put them in Zika. He is going to move some of the pieces around on the chessboard here in the hopes that he moves the right one. But sadly, it will endanger innocent people. And there's something else to be considered. His amount is $1.1 billion. The president asked for $1.9 billion. For some reason, Senator Cornyn believes that we can reduce the threat of Zika virus by 40% on the floor of the Senate. I don't buy it. This is a public health emergency. Reducing the funding for it from what the president requested by 40% is playing Russian roulette with innocent lives across America and around the world. Senator Cornyn's amendment cuts base funding in order to provide for the Center for Disease that ordinarily would be provided to the Center for Disease Control. Also, we're dealing with lead poisoning issues across America. Front page story, Chicago Tribune yesterday. All of the lead testing around my state of Illinois finds that in areas you wouldn't dream of, the suburbs of Chicago, in fact, some of the wealthy suburbs of Chicago, sadly, have too much lead in their water. We know after Flint we have to take it seriously. The impact on innocent children is obvious. Cutting back on funding for that to pay for Zika virus, that's robbing Peter to pay Paul. Lastly, we have an amendment to be offered by Senator Blunt. It is like Senator Cornyn's approach in that it would only provide $1.1 billion, and I would take exception to that number. As I said, 40% less than what the president believes is needed for this emergency. But it would not cut the money out of the Prevention Fund. So that's a positive thing to say about the Blunt amendment over the Cornyn amendment. This amendment is an improvement, but still, it is important for us to adequately fund public health defense for innocent Americans. When Dr. Frieden of the CDC tells us how much the CDC needs to fight Zika, I trust the doctor. I do not believe we should second-guess his approach, and I don't believe we should provide the Center for Disease Control with less money than Dr. Frieden says is needed. That said, I appreciate that Senator Blunt is trying. I hope that the initial amendment by Senator Nelson passes, That is the responsible amendment to deal with a public health emergency. We've seen Zika coming for months, and we've had the administration's detailed, comprehensive plan of action sitting up here for over 3 months. The time to act is way overdue. It's my hope the Senate will finally approve Zika funding this week, and that House Republicans will stop their stalling as well and get to work and do the same. We've lost enough time already.